Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Richards, Technical Services Manager of the Managing General Agents Association, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon. This is being delivered by HDI Global Specialty Pricing Team on the subjects of inflation and actuarial view. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points. First of all, please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Time allowing, these will be asked and answered at the end of the event. If we run out of time, questions will be answered post-event. The presentation is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. This briefing is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be issued post-event together with the slides and our feedback survey. Please take the time to complete our survey, which will take no longer than 2 minutes. This allows us to deliver the best possible future events to our membership. So to recap, today's briefing is on the subjects of inflation and actuarial view from the HDI Global Specialty Pricing Team. So let me introduce you to our presenters, Adam Dewdney, Head of Actuarial, UK Branch, and Tom Kelly, Delegated Authority Pricing Manager, UK Branch. Adam is an experienced actuary who has been working in the insurance industry since 2002. He joined HDI Specialty in 2007 and now heads up the UK pricing and analytics function. Prior to this, he worked in pricing and capital roles at Aviva. Adam leads a team responsible for delegated authority pricing, single risk pricing, portfolio analytics, case pricing, and other general underwriting support. Tom joined the actuarial team in HDI Global Specialty in 2018 and has managed the delegated authority pricing team since the start of 2020. His team work very closely with the delegated authority underwriters to understand the expected profitability of agents, as well as provide ongoing monitoring and support for the portfolios. Prior to this, Tom had worked in various pricing and reserving roles at RSA Insurance Group. So without further ado, enjoy the briefing, everyone, and over to you, Adam.
Hi, thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I'm Adam, as Tim's already introduced me. So that's me and Tom, and yeah, we're here to talk to you about inflation and broadly how we think of inflation as actuaries. So yeah, we do work for HDI, but any kind of views and opinions that we express during this presentation, there are opinions, our personal opinions, and not necessarily those of the company we work for. So our presentation's about 50 minutes long. We've got time for questions at the end, but I think you can type in the chat if you have any questions as they come up, and if I see them and Tom sees them, yeah, we'll do our best to answer as we go, or possibly we'll wait to the end. We've got some interactive bits as well. So if you've got your mobile phones ready, then you can type in the codes and you can get involved in the presentation yourself. So yeah, next slide, please, Tom. So learning objectives. So what we hope to get across to you in some way during this presentation, to explain what we mean by the term inflation, listing key drivers of inflation, how they vary by class, and outlining how inflation doesn't only impact the cost of claims, and summarise how we consider inflation in pricing. So generally speaking, the presentation is quite a simplification. There's a lot more we can do. It's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, and you're warned, we have put some formulas in there. We're both actuaries, we have to put some formulas there. So there you go. Also, what we're covering in addition to the kind of advertised learnings is some other considerations. So we think about what happens if you have an inflation-linked exposure measure even. We talk a little bit about how inflation affects long-tail and short-tail business, and there's a section at the end on deductibles, limits, and aggregates. So what we're not covering, so we're not making any comments on what we believe future inflation will be. That's anyone's guess and really not our expertise. And we are focusing on pricing and direct pricing in particular. So we're not covering the effect of inflation on kind of insurance operations or reinsurance or anything like that. Okay, with that introduced, I think we're over to Tom for our first interactive session.
So
see how this works.
To try and make sure the tech all works and everything like that, we are using Menti for some interactive elements to this to ask you guys questions. There are three ways to join our Menti quiz, or whatever you want to call it. You can scan the QR code pictured in the slide with your phone. You can go to menti.com and use the code 695-76030, which is listed there. Or I have put the web link in the chat for anyone who can get access to that as well, which may also be easy. So hopefully as many of the 50 odd people that are in this call can join. And the first question that we would like to ask everyone is just what comes to mind when you think of inflation. So what are your concerns, or what are the things you would want to know about inflation? And we will try and bring up a big summary of everyone's answers. We have answers coming in. The tech is working. This is good. This is what we wanted. So feel free to fill in as many comments as you want, but I will start to share people's results now on the screen. Right, yeah, so we have some common things. So in a word cloud, the words that are bigger will mean that multiple people have put those as answers. So we have cost and claims and expensive and all those problems around that we would generally think of with inflation. We have to always remember with inflation is that it impacts us as people as well as us as people of the insurance industry. So it's not just a case of the claims costing more. You know, everyone is feeling the pinch. It is increasing. I can see that word, and whenever inflation increases, it does ultimately end up in a higher insurance prices from our point of view. But at the same time, that adds to the cost of living crisis as well. So you almost end up in a bit of a spiral in places. What other words can we pick out from there? Hot topic. It is a hot topic. Maybe slightly cooled over the last couple of months, but the latest numbers from the Bank of England suggest that inflation is staying higher for longer than they expected. Good. Thank you for everyone who's contributing. Most of this was to prove that the tech does work, so that's great. I won't cover all of those because there's far more than I expected actually, but we'll move on to the next slide, because what we've tried to do is move back to here, is to summarize some of the big scary headlines that you probably are all quite familiar with in terms of the topic of inflation. When we think about these, and a lot of these highlighted areas come back to what was mentioned in the word cloud just there, that we have some common themes around wages and food and energy, you know, cost of living crisis that we're experiencing at the moment. It's not just in the UK, let's just point that out. It is across much of the world, and we'll cover a bit on that later. What we all hope is that whenever, you know, the cost of milk and cheese, as we have in one of the headlines here, goes up, everyone gets a bit of a pay increase to pay for your extra costing milk and cheese. That's not always the case, and there's often a misalignment between those two. It's hard to mention inflation at the moment without mentioning Russia and Ukraine war. You know, the energy prices have been, the increased cost of energy prices has largely, certainly in Europe, has been caused by the restrictions put on Russia and their ability to provide us with oil and gas, and that's pushed prices up. One of the things that people often forget is the government. So I've highlighted the Tories here. Certainly a lot of this started to arise from our previous Prime Minister's actions over her very short period of time, but can also be a significant driver in increased inflation. And one thing that I couldn't find an appropriate headline for was COVID-19. If we go back 2 or 3 years, actually this was a kind of snowball waiting to happen, that COVID-19 and all the restrictions in being able to move, but also to be able to transfer goods and stuff like that across the company, across the world, sorry, was also, if anything, the start of this process, and what has, with the likes of Russia and other things going on, has just culminated in the inflation environment that we have today. So, okay, we're all relatively familiar with the pain of it all, and it's all very negative and horrible headlines and things like that. But actually, let's just break down the issue of inflation and just so everyone's on the same page, make sure we know what we mean. So I'll pass over to Adam for that piece.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So on the left, this is a definition that I got from the Investopedia website. And this is kind of the general definition of inflation. It seems a fairly typical one from a quick Google search. So rising prices, which can be translated as decline of purchasing power over time. So that's very general. We need something for insurance that's a little more specific. And that's what we have on the right. And this is actually also the Lloyd's definition of inflation. So we have changes in expected cost for a like-for-like policy over time with consistent limit structures and wordings. So essentially what that's saying is if you have an identical policy this year and you have positive inflation, it's going to cost, the expected cost of paying the claims of that policy is going to be more than it would have been last year. Then we have economic inflation. So the economic inflation is the part of that inflation that can be described through well-known indices such as RPI, CPI, or one of the ASHI indices, many other indices that could be used as well. We also like to define excess inflation. Excess inflation is essentially the part that cannot be described as part of an economic indice. So this is the stuff that sits on top of that. That can be kind of social inflation, so courts are awarding more. It can be a high propensity to claim, or it can be that people are generally asking for more money, and then when they get to the claim stage, or companies need more money when they get to the claim stage, and that can cause inflation as well. So the relationship between those, so claims inflation is the kind of encompassing one that we're looking at in general, and the one we're concerned about this inflation. And if you look at the formula at the bottom, then that's saying it's the sum of the economic inflation and the excess inflation. The last subject we have there, or the last definition we have on this slide, is the social inflation. We see that as a subset of the excess inflation. So that's the part of excess inflation that is due to social trends. So that can be increased litigation. I mentioned a few of these earlier. Broadening definitions of liability, kind of another legal thing, or just general larger compensatory awards. This can be an enormous topic, especially in the US, when you're getting a lot of these nuclear verdicts. And are those nuclear verdicts getting bigger? Are they getting more frequent? And these are coming out of like more plaintiff friendly states. And yeah, they've caught a few people and a few companies by surprise. So broad definitions of claims inflation there. Back to you, Tom.
So the relatively easy bit, easy in the broad spectrum of inflation, is the economic inflation. So if we have a look at just two indices that I hope people are relatively familiar with, we have consumer price inflation. So that's CPI. That's the cost of things. It's measured as a basket of about 750 different items, the price of them this year versus the price of those last year. CPI will be the headline inflation indices that you will have heard about. In the UK, inflation hasn't been over 9% since 1990. The Bank of England is expecting this to fall in the middle of next year, but actually their initial revision was that they expected to fall by the end of this year. So already the inflation, or at least CPI inflation, is staying higher for longer than was initially expected. On the other hand, we have our ASHE index, so annual survey of hours and earnings. So this is over a similar time frame how the average person's salary has increased over time. And you will see over the last, say, 5 to 6 years, there has been an increase in people's salaries. So it was around, say, 2%. It now looks like people's salaries are going up by about 6%. But you can see that's quite a way off of the CPI index. And so there may be a chance that in the future, the wages inflation has to increase significantly to catch up with CPI and vice versa when CPI starts to fall. What some of you may have noticed is that this graph of CPI only goes up to, it doesn't breach 9%, but in some of the headlines I showed earlier, it was claiming 10, 15%, you may have heard some places as well. What is the nuance with economic indices and what makes it difficult is that it really does depend on what's being included, and this will vary both within, say, the Office of National Statistics in the UK, but across countries as well. So the CPI index at the moment, as provided by the ONS, includes the cost of housing. So that's mortgage payments, rent, council tax and things like that. They haven't been going up by the extreme numbers that we're used to knowing about. They have been going up by a lot, but sort of 4, 5, 6% as opposed to 10. And that brings the average down that is shown here. A lot of the indices you see that are reported in the headlines in the newspapers, they exclude the housing market, or housing costs, should I say. And therefore, if you exclude that lower section of the basket, then they show a higher number in general. You can also see CPI indices excluding energy costs. So energy costs have gone up much higher than 10%. And so we'll show a different picture as well. And on the wages and salaries, this is a graph of everyone's salaries, but should you include part-time workers and pieces like that as well, that all make things quite different. So although it may feel like economic indices are the easy one, and we can just look them up online and take whatever is being shown as the truth, you do have to be really careful with what is included within those indices, and also how every country varies in their calculation of that. Not only do we have variations in calculation, but we also have variations in countries and territories as it is. The map that's been provided here is the inflation across 44 countries in 2022. So it's a little bit out of date now, but it's still kind of useful for the point that's being made. Now, I think we can all accept that different countries have different levels of inflation. The UK targets around 2%, but other countries may choose to do something different. That's not necessarily high inflation in itself. It's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it's what you're used to. So a country that has always had 10% inflation is relatively predictable, and we certainly, from an actuarial point of view, it makes it quite easy to allow for that within the pricing. What is an issue is when we get inflation shock events, and this is certainly what we're seeing at the moment across much of the world. Here I've listed the top 3: Israel, Greece and Italy. They all experienced a near 20% increase in their inflation rates. These were going from inflation rates that were, say, 0.5% up to 10%, which is a significant shock and very difficult to A, predict, and B, then price for in insurance. We have other economies on the other end of the spectrum, so China, Indonesia and India, where their change in inflation has been relatively nominal, sort of 1 or 2% change in inflation, which is probably considered within the normal noise or levels of variation within inflation, and is quite a bit easier to predict. So high inflation countries, or doing business in countries that have high inflation, isn't necessarily an issue. What makes it particularly difficult is when we have those varying economic indices, is also when we have shock events, which cause significant changes over time. And I imagine some of these countries will start to, over the next coming years, experience the opposite, which will be an inflation drop as we respond to, as hopefully everything starts to get a bit more back to normal. So thinking about that and thinking about our economic indices, we have another Menti for you.
Yeah, so back over to you. You can use the same link that was there before. So I think once Tom updates it, it should automatically refresh. And then we can see the results coming up. Oh, that's still the old one.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay, what you might also notice, so if you go in, you tick the boxes of the inflation that applies to your line of business, or if you are involved in multiple lines of business, perhaps do the last line of business you were working on. So we're not covering everything there. So you will see there's a box for other. So please feel free to use that. And yeah, if you are ticking the other box, it'd be really helpful if you could type what other inflation you are exposed to in the other box, in the chat even.
No pressure though.
Yeah, it looks like we've done a pretty good job of cover. Oh, we have one other, so 1% in the other. Yeah, so building repair costs and wages and salaries. These are definitely wages and salaries would be one that I'd expect in almost everybody's, in every line of business, because we're going to need people to get involved for paying the claims. Yeah, quite a few building repairs. So some property insurers, some motor insurers about. Okay, I think this is more or less stabilized now, Tom. So yeah, the purpose of this is kind of showing that there are lots of different inflation that people can be exposed to, and quite a spread just even in this core. Yeah, whoever put the other in, I guess, hasn't put it in the chat, so I can't talk about what the other one was. So, okay, I guess we'll move on to the next slide, which I think might also be mine, in fact. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, Tom's already been talking about the indices, and yeah, generally, they're really useful to use, especially if you have a firm or part of your business that is going to be doing the projection of those indices. You can also find a lot of indice projections kind of in the public domain as well. So it's generally really quite useful if you can explain the inflation you expect to suffer using an indice. But yeah, as I mentioned before, they can't always be explained in indices, so we have the excess inflation as well. So how might this look? So you don't need to have only one indice that explains your inflation, as you saw from the previous slide as well. There can be more than one effect of inflation. So you can have the buildings costs, you can have the wages and salaries. So you might want to use both of those, and then with an excess inflation on the end. And that's what this slide is trying to show. So you'd have a multiple of index 1, multiple of index 2, and multiple of index 3, and so on and so forth. And anything that those indexes are not explaining would be left with the excess inflation. So an example of this you could have for, I don't know, one line of business, 70% CPI inflation, 30% of the wages and salaries inflation indice, and then plus a broad blanket 2% because you think actually the inflation for your line of business is higher than the weighted average of those two, so you're adding 2% over. An important point to mention, as we kind of also covered earlier in the presentation, you can have different CPIs, different wages and salaries in different geographies and different economies. So you can also weight in the different economies as is represented in your book. So if you're half in the US, half in the UK, then maybe you do 50-50 on each, or maybe you separate them out and you look at the two books completely separately. So lots of different ways that you can have a look at this. Okay, and on to the next slide, please. So yeah, one of the learning objectives, are we only caring about claims costs? Yeah, so the answer is of course not, but it's very easy to think about inflation. You think about the costs of the claims getting larger. So we like to call that severity inflation. So the severity inflation is actually so for a like-for-like claim, if you have the same claim last year as you do this year, and it's more expensive this year because of inflation, then we're saying that it's the severity inflation. The frequency inflation, then that is more kind of related to social inflation usually, but not always, where you are getting just more claims coming in. So sometimes this can be called a frequency trend. And yeah, we've had loads of exciting arguments about whether we should be calling it a trend or an inflation. And if we do call it inflation or a trend, then which is inflation, which is a trend? And yeah, it's a hoot in the actuarial world. So so for the rest of this presentation, and in general, we're kind of saying that it doesn't really matter. You can have you can call it a frequency inflation or trend inflation. The result is that you're getting more, or perhaps in some cases less, claims due to some external factors.
Okay.
So over to the next Mentee.
So on to another Mentee here, if I just move that on. So for this third and final Mentee, you might be pleased to know, what we've got is we've got 5 scenarios that may or may not impact your line of business. I'm sure at least one of them will to some extent. What would be interesting to know is what your vote is on whether this is a severity event, so this event has caused claims to cost more, or whether this is a frequency event, so this event has caused you to have more claims, or less. It can be negative as well, just to point out. It's a sliding scale, so you can vote for both. So you can put your little slider in the middle if you wish, but try and think for your line of business or whichever one you were doing in the previous Mentee, whether yours has caused a change in claims costs or whether these events would cause a change in claims numbers. And we'll try to discuss some of these. There is no right answer, by the way, so don't feel like you're under any pressure to get it right. There we go. So slightly leaning on the side of severity inflation across the board, but that's pretty normal. Just by way of example, as people's results keep coming in, as mentioned, it really does vary by your line of business. COVID-19, there were classes of business that have seen an increased number of claims and certainly increased number of, or the cost of some claims. If you look at, say, business interruption or something like aviation whole war or something like that, they will have definitely seen more claims due to COVID, event cancellation as well. But that can be, in event cancellation, it's kind of a frequency event. So there's more claims, but actually the cancellation of events isn't costing any more. It's just we happen to get more of them because of COVID. On the other hand, there's been frequency reduction. So anything to do with the travel industry has seen less people travel. The pet industry has seen more people stay at home and kind of care for their pets a bit better, if that's a way of putting it. So there are negative trends within that as well, and it all just varies depending on your line of business. Cyber ransomware, I personally think can be both, so it doesn't really matter where you put it. Ransomware events are increasing in their frequency, so we are seeing some inflation for ransomware events, but they're also costing more. The people doing the ransomware attacks are generally trying to extort more money than they were in the past. So it is a bit of both. Russia, Ukraine, in general, has actually been a driver of inflation for most lines of business because of the various restrictions that come into place there. But as I mentioned, aviation whole war, that would be something that would have caused more claims to have occurred, and so they will be seeing a frequency event there. Personal accident lawyers can be both, but in general they the ones who kind of drive up frequency. So when they see a loophole or a way of getting around the current, or basically causing more law cases, that's what they have been labelled as doing in the past. That they will be a frequency event, and that is something that is always challenging to predict. And then I agree with the economic recession at the bottom. It's a bit of both. So with an economic recession, you can get people inflating claims because times are hard and they need to recoup some more money. So you get some severity type impacts, but you'll also get frequency impacts. So when people lose money, they're more inclined to want to blame someone and therefore sue them for it. And you can see that in conveyancing PI, for example, would be another case. So it does really vary, but it's worth thinking about for your line of business how the kind of drivers of inflation may either cause you to have increased claims costs, but also increased number of claims. We head back to the slides. So what you've all signed up for is how do we do this in the pricing? Well, the first thing we need to do is understand how our exposure measure is impacted by inflation. So we can charge the price, we can set the pricing to be whatever we want, but actually some of our exposure measures will inherently have some inflationary impacts in them, and we need to consider that first before we decide how much we need to change the prices by. What I've tried to do is bring some examples of exposure measures that may have no inflationary impact. These tend to be the exposure measures which are a count of something. So number of pets, vehicle years, aircraft seats, that kind of thing. You'll have one pet this year and you'll have one pet next year. That there is no inflation within that measure. And so any inflationary adjustments won't be achieved through your exposure measure. They'll be achieved through your pricing changes. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have all inflation. So all inflationary considerations are considered within your exposure measure. These tend to be the limit total loss policies. So whereby the loss is either the limit or nothing. And so it's kind of set when you take out the policy what your maximum or your payout would be in the event of a loss. And that can't really, that limit that's been chosen as part of the policy, that should cover all of your inflationary needs. And so will be looked at there. Then you have where I would say quite a few lines of business probably sit is the sum inflation piece. So these will be where quite common exposure measures, turnover, insured value, wage roll, etc., where those measures will increase over time as they are impacted by inflation. So your prices as a result of that will increase because your exposures increase in line with inflation. However, the issue we have to consider there is whether the change in turnover or the change in insured value is linked to the resulting claims that you get, because sometimes you can get your exposure measure may not necessarily link to exactly what your payment of claims are. For example, let's take insured value on the property side. So your house value, well, sometimes part of the claim amount that you're paying can be related to wages, and the builders or whoever have to correct the issue with your property. The property market and the wage market may be completely different, and so they don't always align perfectly in terms of covering off all inflationary measures.
Yep. So how does that all fit together? So we've talked about the frequency inflation, severity inflation, which kind of is the total claims inflation. And we're saying that can be offset a little bit on the left-hand side of the scale by your exposure inflation. If you want to know, and this is important because you need to know, if you know what the inflation is, you know what your exposure inflation is, you kind of, if you want to maintain the profitability of your account, you need to know what is the trend, you know, how much do you need to increase your prices by? So yeah, the formula for that's in the bottom part of this slide. That shows you the formula you need to calculate your loss trend, and that's the information that you need to work out how much you increase your prices. Yeah, now as Tom was saying, typically the exposure inflation is not going to fully offset all of your inflation, so there would be generally a price increase required. You also, in addition to the example that Tom gave, you also have to be careful, even if you do have a good match between your exposure inflation and your claims inflation, you can still get an issue where your exposure inflation is happening now and your claims inflation, you don't pay your claims for another, say, if it's a liability book, you might not pay it for many years later. And then by the time you get to pay the claims, you're in a very different inflationary environment to the one that you were in when you set the premium and when you charge the premium. So that's one of the downsides. But in general, it's pretty good having an inflation-linked exposure measure because it happens immediately. You don't have to think about, do you need to make pricing changes? You don't need to make changes to your systems or anything like that. It will adjust in real time to the exposure inflation that your policyholders are suffering. So the point of this is that you need all of the ingredients to think about when you come to reprice.
So I guess this is what the actuaries are here for. What we are kind of known for is taking our past claims, adjusting them to today's values to try and set tomorrow's prices. That's what we're trying to add value to the insurance chain. Now, this has some significant challenges, I guess, when you are thinking of the topic of inflation. Future projections in general can't just be lifted off the internet. I produced the graphs in the early slide from data that's historic, so we can look backwards, but actually forward-looking is incredibly subjective, and very few people actually provide that, certainly not for free. And that information is hard to get hold of, and also, everyone can have a different opinion on it. And if we all knew the answer, we probably wouldn't be here. You then need to start blending everything together as well. So we've already listed the number of potential inflation indices you need to think about. We blend those together in a subjective weighting of some sorts. We need the subjective loading of excess inflation, which is, as I say, very judgment based. And then something that I'm going to touch upon in the next couple of slides is just how that might impact underwriting years. So this may not impact everyone on the call. If you work on a calendar year or accident year basis, this kind of becomes a little bit easier to some extent. But if you work on an underwriting year basis, we can only set the prices today for our business, but actually we may be paying claims from previous underwriting years that just haven't happened yet. So let's just talk about how we change from calendar year to underwriting year. So all of our, or at least most of the publicly available indices are on a calendar year basis. So what does that mean? It means what was the cost of the shopping basket now versus that same shopping basket 12 months ago. So on an underwriting year basis, claims will be paid across multiple calendar years. So for example, if CPI is expected next year to be 4.8%, 5%, well, it doesn't really matter. Actually, that 4.8% of inflation that is going to be experienced in this calendar year, so 2023, will impact claims that will be from underwriting year 2023. So these are policies that were written in the current underwriting year and have experienced claims within the current underwriting year. So that may be about 20% of the book. 50% of the book will be from policies written last year but having claims now. So they'll be experiencing the 4.8% inflation. And then maybe 30% of the book would be policies that were written 2 years ago, so underwriting year 2021, and are only having their claim now. Now, this is a very short-tailed line of business example, but just to say that actually we can only influence the pricing on 20% of the claims that we're going to have in the next year that would be subject to that 4.8% in this example. Now, if you consider longer tail lines of business, those numbers will change, and there can be very long tailed lines which will impact many, many years. But what we do need to think about on top of all the other assumptions that we've considered is the payment pattern that we're expecting for these claims. When do we actually expect to pay them? And therefore, what sort of level should we be setting our inflation to? this is just trying to turn that into a bit of a visual. I hope it's not too scary. But the first column is our CPI index, so that's exactly the same as the previous page. We've got our 10 and our 4.8%. Then you can see across each of the underwriting years how much of a payment we would expect in each underwriting year. So it's the 30, 50, 20 from the previous page, repeated year on year on year. What that means is we can transform that from a calendar year indices into an underwriting year indices, and whereby we have a spike in CPI, the 10% in 2022, that actually gets spread across a number of underwriting years. So our 2020 underwriting year inflation is higher than the calendar year. Our 2021 is a bit lower, but it's still 7%. And then that 10 is also spread into 2022. And these are considerations that just add to the complexity of you can't just take what was in CPI index or a future projection of it. You also have to think about how that will influence your portfolio. And also, it's not just the pricing. As I say, the pricing could be is just being able to influence the current year. If you've got this materially wrong, it's likely that you will have to take a reserving hit, so some adverse movement on your reserves to allow for the fact that these historically written policies were probably underpriced given what we know now. This moves us into the space of long and short-tailed business. So it's worth pointing out that you can only take pricing actions on the current underwriting year. I know I've said it about 3 times now, but that is true whether you're a short-tailed line or a long-tailed line. Short-tailed lines of business, because the claims tend to be paid quicker, you only have open claims on the more recent underwriting years. It is a little bit easier to kind of react to, but actually you can't spread that inflation impact over too many underwriting years. So shorter tailed lines of business tend to take a heavy shock impact, but over a smaller number of underwriting years. Longer tailed lines of business, on the other hand, claims are paid over a longer period. It's likely that more underwriting years will be impacted. Shock events will still happen, but will be spread over a number of underwriting years, but is particularly susceptible to long-term inflation trends. So when we've set prices now, we've made an estimate to what the inflation will be in the future. If we've got that materially wrong across a number of underwriting years, then that can have quite a material impact on longer tail lines of business. So it's important that when we're making these assumptions that we're trying to use as much information as possible and consider all possible avenues for drivers of inflationary trends.
Okay, so yeah, that's how long tail and short tail has a big impact. So yeah, kind of don't. Inflation's much harder with the long tail business. Another thing that makes inflation harder to deal with is if you're writing excess layers, if there's some kind of layer structure to the business that you're writing. And here I will take you through an example. Have one more slide forwards, please, Tom. And yeah, so the example I'm going to talk through here, I must caveat, is massively simplified. So this whole topic is really quite complicated, but in order to have something that I can talk through in a few minutes, I've really tried to boil this down to something quite basic. So if we have a contract set up, so this is the contract, we're writing unlimited excess 150. So yeah, a big layer, excess a reasonably large number. We're saying if we're expecting a claim from the ground up of 200, then we would be expecting to pay 50. Yeah, and just in case there's any actuaries in the audience there, we're kind of ignoring all of the stochastic and the stochastic and Monte Carlo kind of simulation you would need to do this properly. So yeah, this is a straightforward example. So what happens after 10% inflation? Well, after 10% inflation, our expected ground up loss is 220. It's increased. The 200 is increased by 10% to 220, and our loss to the layer is 70. And we're ignoring all any indexation clauses or anything like that in the contracts as well. And so there we go. There's our loss to the layer. So what that means is if you are the insurer writing that higher layer there, then although the underlying inflation is only 10%, your claims cost has gone up from 50 to 70, which is a 40% increase in your costs. So therefore, you're suffering a much larger inflation on that layer. So that means the point of this slide is if you're dealing with layers, if you're dealing with non-proportional insurance, I guess also non-proportional reinsurance, then it's important to think about this very carefully and perhaps get some support. And this, incidentally, is also the reason why excess of loss reinsurers are so keen on having indexation clauses in their contract, because they are really suffering inflation, whereas primary insurers are suffering much less. So in fact, if you were on the primary layer for this, in this example, your inflation would be zero, because you would be paying nearly 115 claims before the 10%, and you're paying the same amount after, because that increase in claims is getting picked up by the higher layer. So if you have in your pricing models or in your rating tables, you have an ILF, then your actuaries or whoever is building your pricing models for you will use a formula that will adjust the ILF to take into account the future expected inflation. If you have more complicated structures like reinstatements, like multiple layers, like anything like that, the only really way that you can price for it correctly is to have a full stochastic model in place where the underlying assumptions into that model can be adjusted. However, if you're doing this sort of business and you're pricing layers, then you are probably knowing all about this already. But to keep in mind, just in case, this is also the case if your deductibles are quite high. You'll have a varying effect on the inflation. Okay, we've reached the end of the presentation. I think we are, almost dead on 50 minutes. So we've got 2 minutes to go through the last part. A reminder of the learning objectives, and I think you can read these for yourself. So a bit that I will add. What did we talk through? So claims inflation can be defined as economic inflation plus the excess inflation, which includes the social inflation. All classes and books of business have their own unique drivers, as we saw in the Menti. Claims inflation comes not only from severity or claims costs, you also can suffer frequency inflation. An inflation-linked exposure measure can go some way to offsetting and therefore offset the need for rate increases as well. Payment patterns are really important in determining underwriter year indices, and also how painful it will be and how much you'll have to adjust your reserves depending on how long your payment pattern is. And claims inflation gets affected by deductibles, limits, aggregates, and reinstatements. So things are not straightforward when you're dealing with non-proportional policies. And that is the end of our presentation. So there are contact details in case you have any questions for us after. We're not selling anything, so we're not going to come and help you out with your models. But always happy to talk about actuarial topics in general. So any questions, let us know. Tim.
So thanks, Adam. So any questions? If you feel like coming off mute, then do, or type them in the chat box. Just give you a few seconds for that. Oh, looks like you've completely covered everything, Tom and Adam, so well done. That's fantastic. Okay, so as Adam said, if you've got any questions, then do feel free to contact Adam or Tom on the contact details you can see there. And in the meantime, it just remains for me to say thanks so much for your presentation today, both of you, Adam and Tom. Thanks also to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to provide your feedback. Do look out for forthcoming MGAA events, and as always, I hope you have a productive afternoon. Thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you all soon.